Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is the first session of the afternoon. We're going to talk about civilian sector vulnerabilities to cyber attacks. My name is Commander Michael Widman. I'm the lead for the strategy branch here at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence. It's my distinct pleasure to speak with you today, and we have a great panel where we're going to talk about critical infrastructure and the civilians' role in protecting it. So during this session, we're going to talk about mitigation strategies specifically to three separate sectors within the civilian community. We're going to look at aviation, medical, and financial services. We have an outstanding group of panelists today. They've joined forces and combined to write three incredible articles. It was a pleasure for me to introduce them. The way we're going to proceed with this panel is that I will let each individual speaker say their piece, talk about their individual piece, and then we'll open up for audience questions at the end. I would like the panelists to say exactly what they need to right off the bat, and then follow it up with questions. Having said that, if you do have questions, we have the opportunity for our audience to look at the bottom right-hand corner of their screen, select the chat function in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, pose your questions to our panelists. Right now, I would like to introduce the panelists. If we can get our screen up, please. Okay, so to maximize our time with our panelists, first I'm going to introduce their papers. The first paper being Strategic Cyber Effects to Complex Systems, Understanding the U.S. Air Transportation Sector. This panel will be headed by Dr. Charles Harry. Dr. Harry is a research professor at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy with over 20 years experience in intelligence and cyber operations. He's director of the operations at the Maryland Global Initiative in Cybersecurity, or MAGIC, which is a great acronym, an associate professor in the School of Public Policy. His public service includes a 14-year career with the National Security Agency and provided strategic advice for policymakers at the White House, regularly appearing before congressional committees to provide testimony. His paper, along with his co-author, Dr. Skanta Vitek, will provide basically a framework for assessing cyber risk. The paper looks specifically at the aviation sector, but the framework could be applied to many other fields as well. And with that, I'd like to hand the floor over to Dr. Charles Harry.
Well, thank you very much, Commander Widman. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. The paper that we're going to talk about today is really focused on an approach for assessing strategic effects as part of a way and framework of understanding strategic risk. We all know that cyber risk in complex systems is a public concern. Certainly, the previous U.S. administration highlighted this very deliberately in their national cyber strategy back in 2018, but it's safe to say that the current administration also views cyber as a national risk, specifically in light of most recent events with Colonial Pipeline. So in that cyber strategy, there's very deliberate language that talks about trying to estimate impact and risk using a consequence-driven approach. And what we've seen over the years is kind of further refinement of that core idea, very specifically rooted in this idea of national critical functions that DHS and CISA have put out, where they really want to focus less on just kind of a sector-specific categorization and much more about very specific strategic actions that we need to protect as a nation. And so this is not just obviously for the U.S., but any nation around the world. So the example, and what we will explore a little bit more today in this quick chat, is really about how we transport cargo and passengers by air as an example. And so for instance, cyber attacks and non-cyber events have really been affecting air infrastructure for certainly over the last 10 years. We have a variety of non-cyber events that we've seen due to poor system rollouts, some physical damage done by fires. And we have clear examples from Delta to United, Southwest, and Alaskan Airlines that have all shown kind of a large-scale set of disruption to flight operations. But in addition to those non-cyber events, we've also seen cyber events. We've seen attacks in Poland, in Sweden, and the Ukraine. And certainly in the United States, we've seen attacks on some smaller regional carriers, including Ryanair in Alaska. And so the threat actor strategic question is really, how do I disrupt flight operations in a target country? And there's different ways of achieving this. You can try to attack directly aircraft systems. You can attack airport infrastructure. You can attack airline infrastructure, or certainly you can think about vendor infrastructure. And so the way to kind of think about this, and I'm going to use a couple of cartoons here, is that it's not just one system. It's not just one device that can lead to a flight disruption. And the reason is because human processes working together really enable flight operations, right? Everything from passenger reservation systems, flight planning software, tower comms, fueling operations, taxiway lighting. And when all those things kind of work together, the plane can take off. So the reality, though, is that behind each one of those human processes are a series of specific devices that when working together will support those human processes and eventually have the aircraft take off. So the problem for the defenders is that even if the majority of these systems work, a threat actor can gain access to part of that set of interlinked human processes and disrupt maybe just a single device, which will cause a cascading failure. So one particular router gets taken out, flight planning no longer works, and now your plane does not fly. And the problem with that is that as that cascades, you now have a lack of flight operations occurring at a particular airport. And now what ends up happening is planes cannot come and go. And then that ends up creating a set of delayed flights across the entire air network. So what we're talking about here is trying to connect through this kind of set of causal elements, how you can go from attacking specific devices to actually disrupting the entire service that you care about. And so the research questions that we were concerned about in this paper were really about how do you try to quantify the strategic effects of a cyber attack on airports, airlines, or even key vendors that can disrupt parts of the passenger air network. And so we wanted to look at two specific types of effects, one on the regional and national capacity loss in the air network. And also we wanted to look at this kind of propagation delay that the impact on a particular airport or airline has on other connecting actors. And then basically what were the kind of greatest areas of concern for national operators and policymakers. So in order to do this, we constructed a large set of national and regional graph structures, taking a look at various airports and connecting them by the flights and the number of passengers that are actually flying between the airports. So we took information from the Department of Transportation in the United States and constructed, based on 2019 data, a set of interconnections between these various airports. So each airport represents a node in this network, and the flights between each one of those airports and the number of passengers that are flying represent the edges, or the edge connections. And so the idea was to be able to start to look at different graph structures based on total flights as well as specific. So the first effect that we wanted to look at was trying to estimate this capacity loss in the air network. And so the idea was, can we take out nodes or can we take out edges, and can we actually compute it in some way? And we developed something called the Strategic Disruption Index, where we were able to look at different effects, where if I take down a node, I can calculate an impact on between 0 and 1. And so a more central node is going to generate, with more volume of traffic, is going to generate a higher impact than a node that's further out in the network. So in the first example, a very central node generates a disruptive capacity loss of almost 48%. And in our second example here, the further out you go in the network, it's much smaller. It's only maybe roughly 3%. So what do we actually look, when we actually look at the data, what do we see? Well, we find that while the national disruptions, even if you take a look at the most consequential airports, is still relatively small. Atlanta is the highest, with about 4% of the entire national weighted effective capacity is lost. But what we really find interesting in this paper is that when you break things up by region, and we broke it up by FEMA region or response region, you actually see fairly distinct differences between national level effects and regional effects. And in some cases, what you find is that the structure of the regional air network, like FEMA Region 1, which is centered around Boston Logan Airport, versus Region 9, which is centered around Los Angeles, generate very distinct and very different patterns of disruption, which was a really interesting conclusion. We also find that when you look at airlines, airlines actually pose a much more significant national level disruption. And in the case of the United States, we find that Southwest can generate more than twice the amount of disruptive capacity loss than taking down the largest airport. So Southwest, because of the nature of their connections and also the number of passengers that are flying on Southwest, generate a disruption that's more than twice the amount. What's really concerning, however, is when you actually start taking a look at very specific vendors. And in one case that we looked at, Aerodata, which is a German firm that handles a lot of maintenance elements, we find that you can actually take down operations at multiple airlines simultaneously. And so in the case of Aerodata, there were multiple flights, including Southwest, Delta, United, and JetBlue, that were unable to fly for 40 minutes. Now, this was not due to a cyber attack. This was due to a botched appears to be a botched software rollout, but it begs the question of what does a cyber attack potentially mean? If it's intentionally targeted, how much of this effective capacity loss can we actually see nationally? And in this case, 36% of the entire U.S. weighted national air capacity was taken down for 40 minutes. So it really underscores the importance of looking at third-party vendors. The second effect that we wanted to look at was this kind of propagation delay. And so the idea is that if you take down an airport like Atlanta, you now have propagation of flight delays because aircraft and persons can no longer move from one airport to the next. And then that creates kind of a ripple effect across the air network. And in fact, when we take a look at something like Atlanta, if Atlanta goes down, you can see this kind of propagation of delay over time, increasing the number or the fraction of flights that are potentially delayed. And we see that there's this kind of range, again, of disruptive and national and regional effects that really are quite interesting to look at. And every airport ends up generating kind of a distinct mix. So we also find that airlines generate different patterns of flight delays. And so if we were to take a look at, let's say, an attack on Delta Airlines, you can see that there's kind of a range of effects in different regions in the United States, but mostly centered along the East Coast. And that makes sense because that tends to track with the coverage that Delta Airlines provides across the country. Now, if you were to compare that with, let's say, Alaskan Airlines, which primarily focuses its operations in the West, you can see a distinct difference in effect. So an attack on Alaska is going to have a very different effect on the air network than you're going to see if you take down Delta. And of course, if we were to compare that with Southwest, you can see that there's this kind of interesting set of disruptions both along the East Coast and the West Coast. So what about those third-party vendors, though, that we were just talking about with AeroData? Well, if we take a look at AeroData and we were to do the same type of analysis and actually look at the real data that we were able to pull, you can actually see that there are significant flight delays, roughly 200 to 300%. And that will continue to be seen across the air network from April 1st all the way through April 5th of 2019. So there's this propagation of delay, not only on the day of the attack, but also how it continues to manifest itself in the days afterwards. So what are some of the core takeaways then? Well, the core takeaways are that if you are interested in understanding national level cyber risk as applied to air infrastructure, it is largely driven by third-party vendors. There are a handful of vendors that are interconnected across the range of commercial aircraft and aircraft companies that if they are taken down, if some of those core systems are taken down, have this propagation effect across multiple carriers simultaneously. Their coverage in national air networks can generate substantially large losses of capacity. And the details matter, right? So which airports, which airlines you target, which regional networks you choose to go after, even what day and time of event will matter, right? So, and sometimes these results can be somewhat counterintuitive. There are large regional effects that are oftentimes driven by disruptions to smaller airports. And examples of that include Boston Logan. It does not come up with as a top 10 loss nationally, but ends up driving basically a 30% level of disruption in just that region. So prioritization of your defensive investments, must really account for the range of different attacks, either at the airport, at the airline, or even at specific vendor systems. Now, finally, there are a wide range of ways that we can apply this exact same methodology, but to other sectors. And we are doing that with some work ongoing right now, including looking at natural gas pipelines. And the map that I'm showing here is one portion of the U.S. Natural gas pipeline infrastructure. But what processing plants matter, what underground storage facilities matter, are all ways that we can leverage the same type of graph analysis and propagation agent model that we've developed. So I'm happy after the other presentations to take any questions. And I really thank you again for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about our research.
So Charles, that was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. And thank you for reminding the audience that if you do have any questions, we will wait till the end to address those. But feel free to go into the chat, put your questions, and we'll have our authors tackle them at the end of the panels. So our next paper is focusing on the cybersecurity posture of German hospitals. The paper is entitled Epidemic, the Attack Surface of German Hospitals During the COVID-19 Pandemic. This is a work by three authors, Robert Koch, Thomas Brandstetter, and Johannes Klick. Our presenter today will be Johannes Klick. He's the CEO of Alpha Strike Labs and a passionate researcher and IT security expert. His research focuses on global internet scanning for threat analysis and external attack surface detection, as well as identifying cybersecurity infrastructures, organizations, and companies. Essentially, this paper identifies approximately a third of the nearly 1,600 German hospitals and clinics had some type of cyber vulnerability to some degree, which is kind of scary, especially given the current COVID-19 pandemic. To explain this a little bit further, I'm going to pass the floor to Johannes. Johannes, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So Robert will start the session, not me will start the session, so please.
Oh, I'm sorry. So Robert, please, Robert Koch.
Yes.
Robert, are you with us?
I'm here.
Okay, great.
If you have me on the screen, that's perfect. So
Okay.
So I can start with the paper. Hannes will take over in a couple of seconds and describe our approach, what we did during our research. So the basic idea was, when having a look to the scenery last year, based on the COVID-19 pandemic, in the beginning, there were quite some announcement of famous or infamous ransomware gangs the critical infrastructure, that hospitals will not be an attack target based on the situation. And later on, of course, there are a lot of money in the game, a lot of bugs. We had some targeted attacks on hospitals in the sector, and that skyrocketed very much. So while in October 2020, we had a warning from 3 agencies in the United States. So together by the FBI, the US Department of Health and Human Services, and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, there was a warning based on a big wave of ransomware attacks on hospitals. So about 250 hospitals had been hit by ransomware attacks. And if we have a look to Germany, we had an intense discussion based on a case where a patient died on the way to a hospital because the University Clinic of Düsseldorf had to shut down its emergency room because of a ransomware attack. And patients have to be taken to surrounding hospitals, and that resulted in additional travel times up to 30 minutes. So one patient died very soon after arriving at a hospital because the nearest hospital, the UKD, was not available. It was finally analyzed that the patient would have died anyway, but think about, for example, cases of strokes or something like that, where time is really a critical aspect, then that could be a point where a ransomware attack may result in the loss of life. So our research interest was to identify the public-facing attack surface of German hospitals during the pandemic, and Hannes will now present you the structure we built up to scan the systems in the internet and to get the data we required for our research. So please, Hannes.
Yeah, thanks. Hello. So at first, exactly, we thought, okay, what is about the German hospitals? So we at Cyberstrike Labs, we are scanning the whole internet globally every day. And we thought, oh, can we maybe use these scan data from the global internet to identify German hospitals and to find vulnerabilities? And therefore, we have we are our own internet service provider, and we have over 1,000 different IPv4 addresses to distribute our scan traffic to find all network services, well-known network services on the internet. And how we do that is that we have our own /22 IPv4 network and distribute the scanning. We scan very fast, like several hours for one network service port combination. We scan 2.8 billion routed IP addresses and support over 60 different protocols. And in that way, we are able to identify external IP addresses, network topologies, websites, vulnerabilities that belong to an enterprise critical infrastructure or governmental organization. And that is, for us, very important. And here you can see how our system works. At first, we have our front end, and there we say which addresses we want to scan. We say, okay, please scan the whole internet. Then all the IP addresses will be generated, and the scan master will define the scan strategy. In the majority of our scans, we are taking, we are pseudo-randomizing all IP addresses. So we are taking IP addresses in small buckets of work and providing them to on the internet distribution distributed scan nodes. Then these scan nodes are scanning for open ports on the internet. And if they find an open port, then we will start the app scanner and try to identify which kind of network service is behind the open port. And in that way, we are scanning globally the internet. And now the very important part comes, that is the data enrichment. Then we have all the information of what kind of network service is open and running there on the internet. And then we do some kind of attribution, or more better, we add a lot of other open available information, like who is the information, so who is the owner of the IP address, reverse DNS information, so what is the domain of the IP address, the geo IP location, so where is the approximate location of the service, where's the service running on the world, and also BGP routing and autonomous system information. So we know who is the owner of the IP address, who is running the service, and so on. And we taking all the data, putting it together, and putting it on a big database. And then we developed a front end where we can analyze all the data. So here you can see a screenshot from this kind of analysis framework. We call it Inspector. This means we can go step by step through the results. So our analysis is that we do not automatically analyze all the information by an algorithm. We do a semi-automatic way. This means we have like pre-sorting by our algorithm, and then we have a manual verification of the results using the Inspector frontend. So here at first you can see we can identify what kind of what is the name of the URL, or what is the domain. We can see what is the service banner of the service. This means at which kind of software version has the network service identified itself. Then we match all the network services we have identified through a common platform enumerator. This means we have found a standardized way to identify software, to put it to a standardized unique identifier, and having this unique identifier for the specific software and software version, then we can match to vulnerabilities. Then we can look, is for this software version a vulnerability available or not? And then having found the vulnerabilities or not, then we can also check if maybe some exploits or malware is specifically available on open and public exploit databases. And on the right side, you can also see, in case that we have web services, we have also screenshots for verification that the service is really belonging to the entity we are looking for. And using these techniques, these global scan techniques, and these semi-automatic analysis way, and this front end for vulnerability identification, and also for false positive identification, then we have connected this big database with the DV Internet Register, Intensive Care Register. So what is a DV register? So in Germany, we have about, more than 1,300 hospitals with intensive care units for COVID-19 patients. And there's a big open database. It's available, and we can download the database, and there stands the name for each hospital and the approximate geographical position of the hospital. So we have, and then we have also researched for each hospital the domain name, and that was everything that we have entered into our search engine. This means we entered in our search engine in the end 1,300 names of hospitals from the intensive care unit register of Germany, and also 1,300, and then approximate 1,000 domain names of these hospitals, and then we found a lot of services. So we have looked for 89 different protocol scans, have analyzed about 1.5 terabyte of data. It took like 60 hours on a 64 CPU core system, and we have identified over 13,500 network services on the internet. And this, for time reasons, I will skip that. And this means that we have identified approximately from these 1,300 hospitals, according to 13,000 network services, we have found that approximately 400 to 500 hospitals have been vulnerable. This means we have identified our network services of the hospitals, and then we can say, okay, from all 1,228 hospitals we have found, approximately 36% have at least one vulnerable web or internet service. That's a quite high number. That means that more than 1/3 of German identified hospitals has at least one vulnerable service. So at next, what we have done, we have seen here in the chart, you can see that more than 50% of all the network services identify themselves with their specific version number. So in security best practice is that the network service does not identify itself so in a way that you can predict the service number or the operating service type. And here we can see that Microsoft is running, or that it's an open SSH or specific web services are running. So this means every second hospital server identifies this specific version number, and this helps attackers to identify also vulnerabilities. Exactly. So, and furthermore, very interesting to see is that a lot of here you can see the distribution of Windows services we have found, and we can see that also some hospitals are running very old Windows 2000 or Windows XP services. Like you can see Microsoft IIS 6.0. That's very, very old services that are running that are like 10 years not patched, right? Not patchable because Microsoft has ended the support. We can see that also 25% approximately use very, very new Windows 10, but we have a lot of older Windows 7s are running in the end. So now very interesting here is the geographical distribution of the hospitals. On the left side, you can see all hospitals that we have identified in the German intensive care unit register. And on the right side, that has a network service on the left side. And on the right side, you can see all vulnerable German hospitals. And you can see that this is not a specific urban problem, it's also a rural problem. So this means it makes no difference if it's a hospital that is in a city or that is somewhere in the country, right? Very interesting to see. Then we have also done further analysis. We have seen, okay, this picture here shows the hospitals according to the geographical solution provided by the intensive care register. Then we have taken our own geographical solution. This means we have taken our internet service results and have predicted according to the network service IP address where approximately the hospitals are located. And here we can also see the same picture, because it could be maybe happen that also hospitals have maybe some cloud systems running and so on. But here we can see that the distribution is quite equal. So it's very interesting to see that also the network services are quite near located to where also the hospitals are located. That means that that's a high probability that hospitals are not using that much cloud systems in the end. Very interesting. Okay, now Robert will speak about the distribution of the criticalness of the network services we have found.
Thank you very much. So in this picture, you can see the overall distribution of the severity of the different vulnerabilities we identified. We did the analysis based on the common vulnerability scoring system, which is very, very famous. So the worst vulnerabilities are rated 10.0. And you can find that we identified a huge number of very critical vulnerabilities. So over 900 rated 9.0 to 10.0. And just to give you an idea, we identified, for example, some Windows XP operating systems, which are 10.0, and the end of support was back in 2015. We identified, and you see the changing situation with a lot of remote work and home office and stuff like that. For example, open Jitsi video chat servers, or we identified open unauthenticated squid proxies, so proxy servers, which can be easily abused, for example, executing attacks or something like that. A lot of outdated Apache, PHP installations, things like that, or Citrix remote access vulnerabilities rated 10.0, or for example, RDP connections facing directly the web. So a lot of really severe vulnerabilities within the data. Another aspect we had a look to was when thinking about critical infrastructure, are there differences between the hospitals? So having a look at Germany, we have specific laws for hospitals that have to be fulfilled when they belong to the critical infrastructure. So in Germany, hospitals which have at least 30,000 inpatients per year belong to the critical infrastructure, and therefore they have higher liabilities resulting from the Gritis Act in Germany. So there are additional laws they have to fulfill. And if we had a look to the data, we had a quite surprising picture. As you can see in the graph, with a look at all hospitals up to 1,800 beds, we have in average about 4 vulnerabilities per hospital. And when only looking at critical infrastructure hospitals, so you may think, okay, they have a higher security, we had in average more than 11 vulnerabilities per hospital. So thinking about that, you can explain that because, yeah, university hospitals are very huge. A lot of these very big installations are university hospitals. They have a lot of different research areas and things like that. So normally they may use a bigger variety of software and things like that. So you can explain the picture, but at least it shows that the hospitals belonging to the critical infrastructure are not more secure than the average hospitals. So to summarize it, we identified a huge number of German hospitals, over 1,500 hospitals with around 1,300 network services running. And nearly 1/3 of these network services had vulnerabilities. And as you were able to see, a lot of them with severe vulnerabilities up to very high scores, 10.0. So about 1/3 of the German hospitals we examined have some vulnerabilities in their network services. And there's no difference between rural or urban regions. Both is affected. And as I mentioned, the final aspect, the critical infrastructures hospitals are not more secure based on the data when looking at the public-facing attack surface in the internet. So quite a huge number of interesting results, some surprisingly, and we will be happy to answer your questions after the last presentation. Thank you very much.
So Johannes, Robert, thank you very much for a very interesting and topical paper presentation. Like you mentioned, we'll be taking questions at the end, so if you have any questions, please type them into the text box. Our final paper will be presented by Bobby Vitrel. The paper is entitled The Vulnerability of Financial Systems to a Systemic Cyber Attack. Bobby is the managing partner of Micro Eagle Capital and a PhD candidate at the Modern War Studies Department at Buckingham University. He's got 20 plus years of capital market experience in London, with the latest being as a partner at Goldman Sachs. Bobby, in this paper, you pose two questions. First, is there sufficient known structural vulnerabilities in the financial ecosystem that can be exploited by a willing adversary? And second, are there plausible scenarios that could see an adversarial nation state launch such an attack? And the answer to both of those was positive, which is pretty scary. So I'd like to hand you the floor to explain further. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. So if I go through the presentation, maybe what I will do first actually is go to, hold on a second. Sorry, yeah. So talk first about the financial sector in itself. Financial sector in itself, we have obviously the number one industry sensitive to cyber attack, but mainly crime. In fact, the latest BIS paper puts the frequency of attacks at 24% for the finance and insurance industry, which is the highest. But interestingly, the total loss is only 16%, and that's obviously because it's a very well defended, because it's a very well funded industry. And so actually the mean loss of the single cyber attack is actually quite low. It doesn't even make it into the 10th percentile compared to other industries. So what this really tells you is, and what this graph here I try to show, is what we see in finance a lot, and more than in any other industry, is a huge amount of idiosyncratic cyber attacks, so which are most criminal in nature. The combination of them, in sum, the numbers is very high. The net loss is again is high but low regarding the number of attacks. But what we don't see is really a systemic cyber attack on finance. So what this paper tries, or what this image, this illustration tries to show is that there are three types of situations. As I said before, we have the idiosyncratic, the attack on a single bank or insurance company. Then we have the danger that that attack spills over into the broad financial system. And I call this a systemic cyber incident by spillover, because obviously the systemic attack was not intended. And I mean with systemic here that the paralyzation of the financial industry leads to the paralyzation of the real economy, which is really the problem a systemic crisis poses, as we saw during the great financial crisis of 2008. The last one, the systemic attack, which is an attack launched with the intent to bring down the financial system, that is something we haven't seen at all. The problem is, certainly from the national security sector, this is something which gets mentioned since the earliest days, but because of the lack of evidence, it has been pretty much brought down to threat inflation. And obviously the corporations, the banks themselves focus on the idiosyncratic attacks, on crime, and the regulators mainly focus on these idiosyncratic attacks not spilling over into the broader financial system. But there's very little attention on this systemic nature. Now, why do we see no systemic attacks on the financial system? There are three very logical reasons. Number one is even adversary states need the system to work in order to take the money out. So even North Korea has zero interest in bringing down the system, given that they are busy stealing money from banks. The second thing is most adversarial states actually do need capitalist resources themselves to fund their growth. So why bring that system down? And the third is, if you really want to launch a systemic attack on another country, there is probably way easier and less defended sectors than the financial sector to attack. Now, given that there is no numbers we can look at, because there is zero evidence so far of a systemic cyber attack, or indeed of any idiosyncratic attack spilling over into systemic, I have come up with a conceptual framework where I look at basically, what is the probability adjusted economic cost of such a systemic attack, and that must obviously equal the expected economic cost of if it happens, times the probability of a successful attack. And this probability of a successful attack is obviously a function of three things: the number of possible vulnerabilities, the technical ability to do it, and the intent to do it. Now, in this paper, I will focus on this probability, but I will not focus on the technical ability, because I think most professionals and regulators agree that the technological ability will exist if the intent is there. So I will only focus on vulnerability and intent. And also when I look in my discussions with chief security officers of banks, mainly they broadly agree that vulnerabilities definitely exist, but the big question is the intent. So I will do the intent at the back and first speak about the vulnerabilities. Before I do that, I want to give a quick review about the literature and the studies out there. As you can see from this graph here, this is from the Bank of England Systemic Risk Survey. So this is, goes out to the banks in London, and what they categorize their biggest systemic concern. And as you can see, really cyber systemic risk really only a concern since 2014. This is not surprising, surprising. The whole concept of systemic risk really only started with the great financial crisis. But obviously, regulators back then focused on quantifiable risks like market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk. They didn't really look at cyber risk. Cyber risk is a subcategory of operational risk in the regulator terminology, and so it was of less importance. The 2014 interest really only surged because of the attack on JP Morgan, where 83 million accounts were attacked, and it probably was a retaliation by the Iranians on Stuxnet. And then obviously 2016, we had the North Korea attempt to steal almost $1 billion from the Bangladesh Central Bank. Back then we had the G7 issue statements on fundamental evidence of cybersecurity for the financial sector. And really only in 2018 did things from the regulatory side become more active. We had the Bank of England publish two important papers, one saying that just because a systemic attack hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't happen. And the second was the paper on the importance of having operational resilience, which is a very interesting innovation in the regulatory approach, because it basically says, as a bank, as a provider of financial services, you should be ready to provide those services, even if all the technical capability has collapsed. And I think this is a very interesting point, because in many discussions with regulators, they would say that the financial sector is now so digitized that actually if the system is compromised, there is no way of going back to manual. We then really have 2018 as well, a good paper by Jason Healy from the Brookings Institute, who described the key difference between a financial and a cyber shock. And what the finance people need to recognize is that a cyber shock is obviously comes with intent. The timing can be specified and increases the complexity of the situation, which is something that normally, if one considers the financial side complex enough, would obviously add to the chaos. Then literally just last year, we had more interesting developments. The ESRB, the European Systemic Risk Board, published two papers on hypothetical systemic cyber attacks. And the Carnegie Endowment has produced a very big report to focus on it. So all I'm saying here is, the good news is that the focus on it has increased substantially, but the problem a bit is that it's still very much focused on what I call a systemic risk by spillover, i.e. that an attack on a specific institution leads to the system to come down rather than to a systemic attack by intent. Now, a systemic attack by intent, as I said before, is a question of the number of vulnerabilities. I listed 10 in my papers of literally just the structural vulnerabilities of the system. They don't mean to be all encompassing. It's just really to show how the system is structured in against the Western system, the West, in case this happens. Number one is just the degree of openness. If we look here at the US and the UK, which is by far the biggest financial centers in the West, you can see when we rank them by economic power and size, actually the adversarial states are mainly, very different when it comes to GDP and size, but they almost don't differ when it comes to financial openness. They're all incredibly close. The quick example is, the 5 biggest banks in the world are Chinese by asset, but you hardly have seen any Chinese branch wherever you are right now. And so you see they are not very connected at all into the international system, while the Western banks are very connected. The second point is obviously the effects it has on domestic politics. We can see, for example, the events in Hong Kong with a new security law. Western banks with important presence like HSBC, Standard Chartered immediately had to support that new law. And that obviously has the potential to literally create domestically for tension in Britain or in Western countries. Again, a problem that these other banks, these other countries don't have. The third thing is currency concentration. Currency concentration is, I don't have the chart now here, but basically pretty much 80% of trading is in the dollar. This currency concentration is a result of the fact that, among other things, the Chinese are not liberating their markets. So it is, the yuan is very lowly represented. But obviously, all you need to do is affect the dollar, and you create a massive crisis of confidence in the West. The next slide is here. Counterparty concentration. I mean, it was interesting. Dr. Harry just now, when I saw these airport charts, reminded me of how we now currently reorganize the financial sector after the crisis. So on the left, you see before the financial crisis, almost everybody traded with everybody. There was a part of the problem is that once trust collapsed, nobody wanted to trade with anybody, and so the system got restructured in a way that we all trade with each other through central counterparties. But obviously, from a security point of view, that increases the number of single points of failure, which is exactly the last thing you would do from a defense perspective. And another important vulnerabilities is, we see concentration of counterparties in finance, like we see in other industries. We have, and again, very similar to the analysis of Dr. Harry just now with what aviation is, there's a Fed paper which state that 23 small financial institutions is enough to attack to bring one of the big five down. So you actually don't need to attack the big financial institution, you just need to focus on the small ones. Same is with a geographical concentration. Well, obviously, most is in the US and the UK. And then obviously we have the issue with the rapid increase in fintech and digitalization in finance, which is not just a problem from the fact that now increasingly systems get used from which were developed outside the banking system, is also that the regulators are hardly managing to catch up with those developments. And then lastly, when it comes to information operations, obviously the financial sector is one which completely relies on data, news, and trust. If data gets distorted, then obviously this is something that would paralyze the market immediately, because if you cannot trust the ticker on your screen anymore, then you cannot transact. And just to give a very, very, it was a very basic attack, but the Syrian Electronic Army in April 2013 managed to penetrate an information system and put out the news that Obama had been attacked in the White House. It lasted, a couple of minutes, but still it was enough to bring it down 146 points down and at a cost of 140 billion. So now, last minute on political intent, and I think this is the big question. Most, as I said, participants in the markets do know that vulnerability exists and that the ability to exploit them would also. The question is the intent. And here I would just say that, the logic reminds me a lot to Norman Angell before the First World War, who said, it can't happen because we're too much interconnected. I think we know that story. I also think that when it comes to, we are still quite bad at reading people's national security interest. I found it very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, the front page of The Economist said that Taiwan was probably the most dangerous place in the world. But from a financial market, that's completely invisible. I mean, Taiwan Stock Exchange is at all-time highs. The Taiwan dollar is at an all-time strength because of the strong demand for the semiconductors. So you do see that the financial market is not pricing in that risk at all. And various other aspects that I think are quite important to take into account. But given that the time is up, I will finish here.
So, Bobby, thank you very much. That was an excellent brief. Happy that you were able to cut us off in time to take a couple questions. The first question deals with Dr. Harry and Dr. Vivek's paper. The question is, do you think we rely on single vendors to provide capabilities that can be attacked, which has a cascading effect across multiple air services and sites? Should the mandated redundant resilience strategy be implemented?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. It's a real challenge. From our analysis, we were able to identify several kind of individual points of failure, which really bodes a significant concern for commercial aviation. I think this is an area, and it's certainly what the Biden administration is now starting to explore with pipeline security, is that there needs to be greater oversight of kind of what these kind of societal consequences are for attacks on private infrastructure. So I think it makes an awful lot of sense for CISA to more deeply understand this kind of set of interconnections. And to Bobby's point about the financial infrastructure, I think it carries over not just for our infrastructure, but for some of these other national critical functions.
Well, thank you very much. Very insightful. Next question will go to our second paper, and the question is entitled, do you have ideas on how to scan or the analysis methods that can be enhanced for your work? Is it a realistic example to get any sorts of metrics on the criticality of vulnerable services?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. So yeah, so we have also legal problems in the end. So yes, of course, we could make more intense scans in a way that we could try to exploit, or that we could try to make stronger scans in the end that maybe has much more impact on the system. And that's exactly the barrier. So by law, we are not able and we are not allowed to try to circumvent any security barrier at all. That's why we only are able to select the service and the binary information and then to map it to vulnerabilities. But there are also other types we have not done for the hospital. So we could also do some more open source intelligence in a way that we could look for employees, email addresses of the employees, that we could also look for passwords, leaked from these employees using their company email address and so on. We could also look if there may be some on the social networks, some very interesting information about maybe some management or IT administrators. So the attack area for hospitals is much more higher than only network services. That's also the human being, and that was not part of our research, but that's also something that attackers in the past have used very often.
Johannes, thank you very much for that quick answer. We will have one more question. This one will be for our last presenter, Bobby. How can one judge the shift in intent that would occur in a situation that would result in open conflict?
Well, I think it's you know, as a market participant myself, I think one of the key questions is always the same way as we look at the security. You know, what is the market pricing and what is the real value of something? And I think the key question here is that at the moment the problem is that intent, at least from is valued at zero, and I just don't think it's zero at all. You know, we are in the West quite bad at judging the criticality sometimes of other states, of certain geopolitical issues. And so I think what is critical here is to understand that we shouldn't assume that it's zero, because that's what history tells us, or that it is very low, the intent. And we should assume that given our way higher degree of vulnerability, what would we do if the financial system is brought down? How can we keep the real economy operating? And in one conversation with the regulator, he was like, well, you know, we are too digitized right now, nothing can be done. Which was very different to, for example, the statement of the Central Bank of Sweden in 2018, which said that obviously one had to be ready to almost go manual in finance again. And I think this is where the conversation between the financial and the military sector is so interesting, because like there are various ideas, obviously, but you could use in an emergency, for example, the military as effectively a commercial banking network to literally just allow the real economy to continue operating. Main point from my side is just that the question needs to be discussed and not just seen as a technical issue, because again, for the structural issues that I mentioned before, there is no national or supranational regulator who can change that. The system is what it is. And the key question is just like, what happens if the system get brought down, because our vulnerability is clearly way higher than any of our adversarial states.
So gentlemen, thank you very much. I think we'll conclude this panel. There was a lot of really good information, and I was happy that we were able to get some questions. But thank you for your participation, and that's all we have for right now.